From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So, hello. I am Rachel Hardigan Shea, editor of the Washington Post Book World. Thank you. The Washington Post is very proud to be a sponsor of the National Book Festival, and I am very proud to introduce the next author, former Washington Post reporter Kirstin Downey. As a journalist, Kirstin Downey has long covered how economic trends intersect with personal lives. Indeed, she was reporting on the risky mortgages that led to the financial crisis several years before the bubble actually burst. But it was her work covering and writing a column about issues in the workplace that triggered her interest in Frances Perkins, who, as FDR's labor secretary, was the first woman ever to be named to the cabinet and a major architect of the New Deal. Kirstin will be signing books at 11 o'clock. Please join me in welcoming Kirstin Downey.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to see you and so much appreciate you all showing up at an hour that's still really pretty early on such a gray day and such a windy day. So I'm very appreciative and always glad to see a crowd of eager readers. Good morning, everyone. This is very interesting and personally meaningful to me because the genesis of my entire book, which is The Woman Behind the New Deal, it's the life of Frances Perkins, was the ring of streets around this building. And I'll explain to you how that happened. And much of the research was done at Library of Congress, which is sponsoring today's events. It's a wonderful institution. The beautiful buildings, there's such important research materials there, and it's all available free. These public access libraries are really one of the things that make our nation great. And I'm very grateful to the Library of Congress for being here and for continuing to give us such wonderful material. Now, this is a self-selecting crowd. I know some of you already know who Frances Perkins is, but a lot of people don't. So let's start by asking this question. How many of you know who Frances Perkins is? Oh, yes, this is great. Good, good, good. How about this? How many of you know someone on Social Security? Please raise your hand. How many of you know someone who is receiving unemployment insurance or who has ever received unemployment compensation? Okay. Frances Perkins' work. How many of you know someone who's working a 40-hour week, generally, more or less? Frances Perkins' work. How many of you know a 12-year-old who's quit going to school so that she can work full-time in a factory? Frances Perkins' work. Her ban on child labor, enacted in the Fair Labor Standards Act, made it possible to keep kids in school longer instead of in mills and factories. Let me start by telling you a little bit. It's awfully noisy here, but let me start by telling you a little bit. I want to read a little bit of the prologue from my book so that you know a little bit more about the breadth of Frances Perkins' accomplishments. On a chilly February night in 1933, a middle-aged woman waited expectantly to meet with her employer at his residence on East 65th Street in New York City. She clutched a scrap of paper with hastily written notes. Finally ushered into his study, the woman brushed aside her nervousness and spoke confidently. They bantered casually for a while, as was their style. Then she turned serious, her dark, luminous eyes holding his gaze. He wanted her to take an assignment, but she had decided she wouldn't accept it unless he allowed her to do it her own way. She held up the piece of paper in her hand, and he motioned for her to continue. She ticked off the items: a 40-hour work week, a minimum wage, workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, a federal law banning child labor, direct federal aid for unemployment relief, Social Security, a revitalized public employment service, and health insurance. She watched his eyes to make sure he was paying attention and understood the implications of each demand. She braced for his response, knowing that he often chose political expediency over idealism and was capable of callousness, even cruelty. The scope of her list was breathtaking. She was proposing a fundamental and radical restructuring of American society with enactment of historic social welfare and labor laws. To succeed, she would have to overcome opposition from courts, business, labor unions, conservatives. "Nothing like this has ever been done before in the United States," she said. "You know that, don't you?" The man sat across from her in his wheelchair amid the clutter of boxes and rumpled rugs. Soon he would head to Washington, D.C. to be sworn in as the 32nd President of the United States. He would inherit the worst economic crisis in the nation's history. An era of rampant speculation had come to an end. The stock market had collapsed, rendering investments valueless. Banks were shutting down, stripping people of their lifetime savings. About a third of workers were unemployed, wages were falling, hundreds of thousands were homeless. Real estate prices had plummeted, and millions of homeowners faced foreclosure. His choice of labor secretary would be one of his most important early decisions. His nominee must understand economic and employment issues, but be equally effective as a coalition builder. He was a handsome man with aquiline features, and he studied the plain, matronly woman sitting before him. No one was more qualified for the job. She knew as much about labor law and administration as anyone in the country. He'd known her for more than 20 years, the last 4 in Albany, where she had worked by his side. He trusted her, and he knew she would never betray him. None of the items I just mentioned were part of the FDR's campaign platform in 1932. Nevertheless, he told Frances Perkins he would back her, and she agreed to accept the job. That night in bed, she actually cried in deep wailing sobs because she knew it was going to be such a difficult job. She would open herself to constant media scrutiny, harsh judgment, and public criticism. Yet she knew she must accept the offer. As her grandmother had told her, whenever a door opened to you, you had no choice but to walk through it. Frances Perkins would become the nation's first female Secretary of Labor. Now, we know what happened after that. The Social Security Act, passed in 1935, gave us unemployment insurance, Social Security, and our welfare system known as aid to dependent children, designed to help the children of parents, of mothers left to raise their children alone. The Fair Labor Standards Act, passed in 1938, set that 40-hour work week. It set them a minimum wage. It put the ban on child labor. Other things she did: FHA insurance. She was the primary booster of the Civilian Conservation Corps. She was the largest single supporter of the WPA. Truly, this was a really remarkable woman. Now, it's a little interesting and unusual that I came to write this book. I came from a staunchly Republican family. I actually came from a family of Roosevelt haters. But when I came to Washington, D.C. in 1988 as a young business reporter, one of the first things I did as I set out to learn my way around the town was to sign up for a trolley bus tour of the city. And one of the first things I noticed was the Francis Perkins Department of Labor. As those of you who live in Washington know, there's very few buildings in Washington named after women. And so I noticed it, and I filed it away and wondered, who was Frances Perkins? I'd never even heard of her. As we went around in the trolley bus on this day I took the tour, we got around over by the Washington Monument, and the tour bus driver said, in his, along with his regular patter, what American woman had the worst childbirth experience? There's a long pause. Frances Perkins. She spent 12 years in labor. That's the first time I ever remember hearing Frances Perkins' name spoken aloud. Now I laughed, like the rest of you did, but it also, as a feminist, kind of irritated me, and ever after that, I kept Frances Perkins' name in my mind, and I kept listening for her. I spent 20 years at the Washington Post, and over the years, I realized how often I heard her name, often like a sort of a distant whisper. When we talked about Social Security, Frances Perkins. When we talked about age discrimination, Frances Perkins. When we talked about the Fair Labor Standards Act and making revisions to it, we talked about Frances Perkins. When we talked about the labor movement, we're talking about Frances Perkins. This was all her handiwork. Quite an extraordinary record of achievement. I spent 20 years then at the Washington Post. I went all over the country for the Washington Post. It was a wonderful life education, going to visit places and learn new things. And as I traveled around the country writing business stories, I began to realize how little I knew about the history of the working people of America. It's something that really isn't taught. In the late 1990s, I wrote a series of articles on sexual harassment. And I heard a lot of chilling stories about places where there'd been an imbalance of power, where people were able to use their power to force people to do things they didn't want to do. There were people who were sort of trapped in a cycle of abuse, and a lot of times the stories were really very bad stories. It's really much more akin to criminal activity than most of us have realized. And I heard all these stories all around the country, and I began to suffer myself what psychologists call secondary stress. And I got afraid to fly. I started to feel like authority figures couldn't be counted on to do the right thing if there were a problem. I suppose part of the issue for me was that I had both the good luck and the bad luck to sit by the Post's fabulous aviation reporter, Don Phillips. And he was writing about every plane crash that happened in America. So every day, and I was afraid to fly, I was overhearing him talk about every air accident that happened and just how the people on board had died. So I started to travel places by train whenever I could get away with it. I took a long trip out west to do a story on the national parks. And on the way, I read Tony Lucas's book, Big Trouble, which is really a fabulous book about the great labor battles of 100 years ago. And I was shocked to realize that actually these were pitched battles. This was almost like warfare out on the western frontier between employers and workers. And I realized how little I knew about that. So I began looking for a vehicle to write about the epic struggle of the working man in America to get a better life. I came back to the Post and I started to write a column called On the Job, where people could write me letters about their problems at work. And one day a man wrote me and said, "At the end of the day, every day, we're locked into our offices while they count the money in the cash register. Do you think that's unsafe?" Yes, it is. Even a rat has an escape hole, he told me. So I decided to write a column on workplace fire safety. And in doing it, I did a little bit of research on the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And I heard that a young social worker named Francis Perkins had actually witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And what she had seen had so horrified her. 146 people died that day, many leaping to their deaths from a building in Lower Manhattan. It was a sweatshop. From that experience, Frances Perkins was so motivated to make changes that she drafted the laws that became our National Fire Safety Act. You might say, Eureka. At that point, I felt, this is a woman who has a fabulous story. It has to be told. This aspect, labor history, is something that is not told very much at all in America. And by telling the story of Frances Perkins' life, I saw an opportunity to do it. Today, in the various tents, you'll hear a lot about political history, military history, civil rights history, but except for me today, you'll hear very little about labor history, and my book has tried to rectify that. I got a contract to write the book. I began doing the research when I got a fellowship at Harvard University. I was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. And at Harvard at that time, there was not a single professor of labor history. At this point now, there's only one major newspaper that employs a full-time labor reporter. That's the New York Times, and it's Stephen Greenhouse, and he has a lonely job. Now, many people advocate heartily for free trade today, but there aren't a lot of people speaking up for the defense of the working people in America. And in fact, that's what Frances Perkins devoted her life to doing, is to talking about the problems of working people and trying to find ways to solve those problems, ways that could also keep America's businesses strong and prosperous. Now, if Frances Perkins were standing here today, I can almost assuredly tell you, what do we think that she'd be talking about? She'd be talking about jobs today. She'd be talking about how to generate jobs and how to bring good-paying jobs back to America. She'd be talking about smart employers who are finding ways to grow their workforces, economic policies that bring good-paying jobs back to America. And she'd be talking about ways to strengthen the labor movement today so that workers can protect their pensions, their right to a 40-hour work week, and their right to health insurance that actually works when it's supposed to. Now, the labor movement, the working people of America, they're the backbone of America, and they're much of the source of our country's economic prosperity. But nobody talks about them very much at all, almost nobody at all. And that's alarming, especially when we face an economic crisis as we do today. This is a matter of particular interest to me because I've spent a lifetime studying the American economy, and the unemployment rate is really becoming a very serious problem for the United States. We need to get people employed with jobs that earn enough money to give them financial security and allow them to buy the things they need, food and housing and health care. I think if Frances Perkins was here today, and I think I have the right to say it, I spent 9 years studying her life, I think she'd say we need to pay a lot more attention again to the working man. And I'm open for questions.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how Frances Perkins, in an era when there were essentially no other women in high political positions, was able to navigate with the other political players in Washington.
That's right. Could everyone hear the question? Okay. It's a really good question, and I think that's part of what fascinated me, is she essentially had to invent the role of a woman in high public office. She had to figure out how she was going to dress, how she was going to talk, even what she was going to call herself. Now, in some ways, this caused her some embarrassment, because early on when she started, someone said that she should be called Madam Secretary. Now, she sort of went along with it, but she didn't realize that after that she would begin to be called the Madam, which made her very embarrassed. She was quite the Victorian, and she never liked that. But she did find herself in the position of inventing everything about herself. She tried to be very careful how she spoke. She tried to speak as men do. She tried to keep her sentences short and to the point. And she tried to make sure that the men never felt like she was stealing the limelight from them. Now, this was very important, that she always let FDR shine, and that was part of the secret of her success. But in fact, every single day of her life, she had to think about those gender issues and how exactly things were going to play out. It was very difficult. In fact, she did find Washington to be just as frightening of a place as she'd feared.
Could you expand a little more on the relationship between Frances Perkins and FDR?
Frances Perkins was, I believe, FDR's closest friend. Now, it's funny because a lot of other men played poker with him, hung out with him, helped him a lot. Louis Howe, Harry Hopkins, Henry Morgenthau, these men were all devoted friends. But across the years, Frances Perkins first met FDR in 1910. When she became his Secretary of Labor, she had already known him 22 years. And he kept her by his side for the entire length of his presidency, the 12 years in labor that I've mentioned earlier, the whole time of his presidency. In fact, she tried to resign repeatedly. She really hated life in Washington, found it very difficult, but he could never let her go. And in fact, when she tried to resign in 1944, she was exhausted, she wanted to go home to New York. He actually reached his arms up to her, put his arms around her and said, "Please don't go. Frances, how can you be so selfish?" And she stayed.
Were there any initiatives, progressive initiatives, that FDR pushed back on or didn't fully implement?
Right. That's a really good question, and in fact, the debate is raging right now in Washington as we speak. Francis Perkins had presented FDR with the list of about 10 items that I mentioned to you at the beginning when I was reading the prologue. I know it's kind of difficult to hear me, but she had presented him a list of about 10 items. The only one she didn't accomplish was national health insurance. In fact, the American Medical Association told Roosevelt and Francis Perkins that they would kill Social Security to prevent what they called socialized medicine from taking root in America. What we ended up with was a health insurance system that grew accidentally. It was a reaction to the wage and price controls during World War II. Companies were not allowed to raise wages, but they really wanted to attract workers. They began to offer health insurance. So we ended up with a health insurance system that was targeted to the strong and healthy, not to the sick and jobless. The program Francis Perkins wanted would have looked more like Medicaid looks today, a program that would be targeted to people who don't have money to pay for health care. She was never able to get that accomplished. FDR abandoned national health insurance to get Social Security enacted. Every 2 or 3 years, she'd bring it up again and say, "Isn't it time now to get national health insurance?" And each time someone would tell her, "No, no, too much of a hot potato, we're not going to touch that one now." And her very last communications with FDR were, "Please don't forget national health insurance."
Thank you so much for your work on her. I'm just deeply grateful to you for having done that. As a feminist, just a minor suggestion. I'm sensitive to the working man and would invite you to say working men and women. But that aside, I wondered if you could talk a bit about what in her childhood might have foretold this deep sympathy to the working people and to those who are kind of left out.
Right. Frances Perkins was a very devout Christian. She was an Episcopalian, and she had enormously deep empathy for the human condition. She was interested in the plight of immigrants. She was interested in the plight of workers. She often said that she felt people's pain. She became fascinated in the American economy. She studied business. She was very interested in businessmen and how businessmen and women, primarily at that time businessmen, and how they conducted their business. But she was fascinated to see the role that workers played in making those businesses prosperous. She wanted to see a better balance of power between employers and workers, and that became her lifetime crusade. She had an enormous number of interests over the years. She was a very big suffrage activist. And so she was very strong advocate for women's rights. She was a birth control supporter too. But she chose the one particular issue, which was worker rights. She made that her lifetime cause, and that seemed to have all gelled for her after seeing the horror of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire.
Relations with organized labor, the unions and that.
Yes, it's a fascinating relationship between Frances Perkins and organized labor. They were mad as hell when she was made Secretary of Labor. Most unions at that time didn't permit women to be members at all, and a lot of the men who were the heads of the labor unions had hoped to be labor secretary themselves. So they were personally resentful, and they were also resentful that a social worker was the one who would be leading the Department of Labor. Over time, though, they saw that she was their most stalwart supporter. And the things that she did enabled the labor movement to grow dramatically in the next 20 years. Now, we know that FDR and Francis Perkins didn't pull the United States out of the Great Depression. The capitalist system eventually recovered after the big employment push of World War II. But the labor movement was the huge beneficiary of this growth. With labor laws, protective labor laws in place, we had an enormous growth of the middle class in America. And the country became the prosperous place that it was in the 50s and 60s. And that's been the base of our country's great global wealth.
Good morning. You mentioned she was a strong supporter of the WPA.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if she had friendships with Lewis Hine and Dorothea Lange, the photographers. Thank you.
Well, the person, Francis Perkins was less immediately involved in the WPA and the public works projects. What she did is lobby for the funding that allowed those programs to happen. She was the reason that any of those things actually happened. And in fact, she has a wonderful story when she went to the White House and battled FDR to keep those programs in place, the money for all the various programs. And in fact, David Taylor will be speaking after me. He'll be talking about the authors program that was part of the New Deal at that time. And Francis Perkins was the biggest single advocate of that.
Hi, my name is Lincoln Music, and I just have a question about the programs she created on, like, what was the top programs that she pushed forward?
I'm sorry.
Her top priority?
I'm sorry, what was her top priority?
Her top priority?
Her top priority was enacting Social Security, and that was her biggest single source of pride in her entire life. She felt it was a program that would last forever, and in fact, there's 50 million people on Social Security today.
Could you comment on her relationship to Eleanor Roosevelt?
Francis Perkins and Eleanor Roosevelt had a very interesting, complicated relationship. They both shared the affection of Franklin Roosevelt in different ways. Eleanor was an enormously valuable, Francis Perkins was the one who came up with the ideas and enacted the legislation. Franklin Roosevelt was the one who had the political savvy and popularity to make things happen. And Eleanor was the one who could popularize these ideas. The two women were friends. They loved each other, as allies of a lifetime do, and they were also fierce rivals and often jealous of each other. At the end of their lives, though, there's a wonderful picture of the two women at the 50th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and their heads are bent in close to each other. And you can see what sincere friendship and affection they had for each other, despite whatever little tiffs they may have had over the years.
Yes, thank you very much for writing the book. I enjoyed it very much, and I agree with you that it's an issue that needs to be brought forward now. Do you think that the book brings any new research or addition to the historiography of that period?
I'd say the things that I learned in my research that were probably news to most people is really what a huge role Francis Perkins played in all aspects of the New Deal. She had sort of gotten erased out of New Deal history. You'll now see whole New Deal history books, including some that are taught in colleges, that mention her 3 or 4 times, 5 times. That's extraordinary. I also found out that Teddy Roosevelt was the person who actually first picked her to head the Committee on Safety after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. So that meant that her first important contact was Teddy Roosevelt, not Franklin Roosevelt. And I thought that was a really cool find at the Library of Congress. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.